More than 1,000 years ago, in a quiet room in ancient China, a small group of men made a mistake. At first, it seemed like a simple mistake. There was fire. There were strange powders. And then, without warning, an explosion. The men were not trying to create a weapon. They were not preparing for war. In fact, they were searching for something completely different. They were searching for the secret of eternal life. But instead of creating something that could help people live forever, they created something that would eventually take millions of lives. Their accidental discovery would destroy city walls, bring down powerful empires, transform armies, redraw borders, and change the course of human history. And it all began with one small explosion in one small room. This is not only the story of a weapon, it is the story of how one discovery changed the world forever. Stay with me, because this journey begins with a search for immortality and ends with one of the most difficult questions humanity has ever faced. What happens when we create a power that can no longer be stopped? Long before guns existed, war looked very different. Soldiers fought with swords, spears, bows, and arrows. Battle was slow, physical, and frighteningly close. A warrior could often see the face of the person he was fighting. He could hear his breathing. He could see the fear in his eyes. Strength, training, courage, and skill could decide who survived. But more than 1,000 years ago, in a land far to the east, everything began to change. During ancient China's search for knowledge, a group of alchemists experimented with fire and different chemicals. They were not soldiers. They were not generals. They were not kings searching for a more powerful army. They were scholars searching for a way to extend human life. They believed that somewhere in nature there might be a medicine that could defeat aging and death. During their experiments, they mixed 3 simple ingredients: charcoal, sulfur, and a white substance known as saltpeter. Separately, these materials did not seem powerful, but when they were mixed together and touched by fire, something extraordinary happened. The mixture did not burn slowly. It exploded. There was a sudden flash of light, a cloud of smoke, and a sound powerful enough to make everyone in the room step back in fear. The Chinese called the mixture Wu Yao, meaning fire medicine. It was a strange name for something that would eventually become one of history's deadliest inventions. The men who discovered it could not have understood what they had created. They could not have imagined cannons breaking through ancient walls. They could not have imagined soldiers carrying rifles across battlefields. They could not have imagined machine guns, world wars, or modern cities filled with armed people. To them, it was simply a surprising chemical reaction. But history often changes in moments that seem small at the time. A door opens, a spark appears, and suddenly, humanity begins walking down a road from which it can never completely return. For many years, gunpowder was not mainly used for war. The Chinese used it during celebrations and religious ceremonies. They placed the powder inside bamboo or paper tubes and threw them into fires. The tubes exploded with loud sounds that people believed could frighten away evil spirits. Over time, these explosions became more beautiful. People learned how to send them into the sky, where they burst into light, smoke, and color. Fireworks were born. Families gathered to watch them. Children looked upward in amazement. For a time, gunpowder was connected with celebration, beauty, and wonder. But somewhere, perhaps while watching one of these explosions, a soldier must have asked a different question. Not, how can this entertain people? But, how can this defeat an enemy? That question changed everything. The earliest gunpowder weapons were simple, dangerous, and unpredictable. Chinese soldiers filled bamboo tubes with gunpowder and attached them to spears. When the powder was lit, flames, smoke, and burning material shot from the end of the tube. These weapons became known as fire lances. They were terrifying, but they were far from perfect. Sometimes the fire traveled in the wrong direction. Sometimes the bamboo cracked or exploded. Sometimes the weapon injured the soldier carrying it. But the experiments continued. Soldiers and weapon makers understood that this strange powder contained a new kind of power. An arrow depended on the strength of the archer. A sword depended on the skill of the warrior. But gunpowder created force through fire and pressure. The person controlling that force could strike an enemy from a distance with terrifying speed. Slowly, the bamboo tubes were replaced with stronger metal ones. Instead of only throwing flames, these tubes began firing pieces of stone, metal, and eventually iron balls. The fire lance was becoming something new. The earliest form of the gun was beginning to take shape, and once that happened, the secret could not remain inside China forever. Ideas have a way of traveling, and powerful ideas travel faster than almost anything else. Gunpowder moved westward along the Silk Road, one of the greatest trade networks in history. It traveled through mountains, deserts, markets, and ancient cities. Merchants carried silk, spices, precious metals, and stories from one land to another. Along with those goods came knowledge. The secret of gunpowder passed from person to person and from civilization to civilization. Scholars in the Arab world learned about the mixture. They studied it, recorded it, tested it, and explored its possible uses. From there, knowledge of gunpowder continued moving west. By the 13th century, it had reached Europe. At first, European armies did not fully understand what to do with it. They already had powerful weapons. They had bows, crossbows, swords, knights, and enormous stone castles. For centuries, strong walls had protected cities from attacking armies. A ruler could close the gates, place soldiers on the walls, and survive a siege for months or even years. Gunpowder threatened to change that balance. European scholars began experimenting with the mysterious black powder. One of the people who wrote about it was an English monk and scholar named Roger Bacon. He understood that the mixture had enormous power, and he wrote about it carefully. But once knowledge is written down, it becomes difficult to control. Other scholars studied it, weapon makers tested it, armies began using it, and soon a terrifying new sound began echoing across the battlefields of Europe. The sound of the cannon. Early cannons were crude machines. They were large, extremely heavy, difficult to move, and dangerous to operate. It could take many men, several animals, and hours of preparation just to place one cannon in the correct position. Loading it was slow. A mistake could cause the weapon to explode and kill its own crew. But when a cannon worked, its power was unlike anything most soldiers had ever seen. It could throw a heavy ball of stone or iron toward a city wall with tremendous force. When it fired, the sound was like thunder. Smoke covered the battlefield. The ground shook beneath the soldiers' feet. and walls that had protected cities for centuries began to crack. One of the most famous examples came in the year 1453. Constantinople was one of the greatest cities in the world. For more than 1,000 years, its massive defensive walls had protected it from invading armies. The walls were tall, thick, and carefully designed. Many powerful armies had tried to break through them. Most had failed. The city appeared almost impossible to conquer. But in 1453, a young Ottoman sultan named Mehmed II arrived outside Constantinople with a powerful army and enormous cannons. Some of these cannons were larger than anything the defenders had ever faced. Day after day they fired at the ancient walls. The sound rolled across the land like a storm. Smoke filled the air. Heavy cannonballs struck the same sections repeatedly. At first, the walls remained standing. Then small cracks appeared. The cracks grew wider. Pieces of stone began falling. And eventually, walls that had resisted armies for centuries began to collapse. When the walls fell, the city's final defense fell with them. The capture of Constantinople sent a clear message to every ruler in Europe and beyond. Walls were no longer enough. Stone could not always protect a city from metal, fire, and gunpowder. The age of the traditional fortress was beginning to disappear. The future of military power belonged to those who controlled cannons, but cannons had one major weakness. They were too large. They required teams of men to transport, load, aim, and fire them. Weapon makers soon began asking another question. Could the power of a cannon be placed inside something small enough for one soldier to carry? Years of experimentation followed. There were failures, injuries, and unexpected explosions. But eventually, the first handheld guns appeared. These early weapons were little more than small metal tubes. One end was closed while the other remained open. A soldier poured gunpowder into the tube, added a small stone or metal ball, and then used a flame to ignite the powder. The process was slow and difficult. The soldier had to carry powder, ammunition, and a source of fire. In rain or strong wind, the weapon might not work at all. It was less accurate than a bow. It was slow to reload, and after firing, thick smoke could make it difficult for the soldier to see anything. But despite all these problems, the gun offered one enormous advantage. A person did not need years of training to use it. A skilled archer might practice for most of his life, a knight trained from childhood to fight in heavy armor. But an ordinary soldier could learn to load, aim, and fire a basic gun in a relatively short time. That changed the balance of power on the battlefield. For centuries, the armored knight had been one of the most feared fighters in Europe. He carried expensive weapons, rode a trained horse, and wore metal armor that could protect him from swords and arrows. Then came the gun. A simple soldier carrying a firearm could now kill a wealthy knight from a distance. Years of training, expensive armor, and social status could be defeated by one metal ball fired through smoke. It was a quiet revolution. Not a revolution of speeches or political ideas, but a revolution of metal, fire, and pressure. Armies began changing. More soldiers carried firearms. Armor became less useful. Old military traditions slowly disappeared. And with every passing generation, guns became lighter, faster, more reliable, and more accurate. But the story was only beginning. With guns and cannons in their hands, several European powers began looking beyond their own borders. They built stronger ships. They placed cannons along the sides of those ships. They trained soldiers to use firearms. Then they sailed toward Africa, Asia, and the Americas. When these ships appeared on distant shores, they did not arrive with equal power. They carried weapons that many of the people they encountered had never seen before. The sound alone could create fear. A weapon that produced fire, smoke, thunder, and death seemed almost impossible to understand during a first encounter. Powerful civilizations found themselves facing invaders with unfamiliar military technology. The Aztec Empire in Mexico fell. The Inca Empire in South America fell. Kingdoms in Africa and Asia faced armies armed with guns and cannons. The gun was not the only reason these civilizations were defeated, but it gave invading armies a frightening advantage. This became one of the darkest chapters in the history of firearms. The gun did not only change wars between equal armies, it created enormous differences in power. Nations with advanced firearms could control nations without them, and for hundreds of years, many of them did. Empires expanded. Land was taken. People were forced from their homes. Cultures were damaged or destroyed. Borders were drawn by distant rulers. Many of those borders still shape the world today. By this point, the gun was no longer simply a weapon used by individual soldiers. It had become an instrument of empire, an instrument of control, an instrument capable of changing the destiny of entire continents. Centuries passed. Then, during the 19th century, the world experienced another great transformation. The Industrial Revolution began. Factories appeared. Machines could now produce objects faster than skilled human hands. Before this period, most guns were made individually by craftsmen. Each weapon was slightly different. A part made for one gun might not fit another. Production was slow and expensive. Factories changed that. Machines could manufacture large numbers of nearly identical weapons. Parts could be replaced. Production became faster. Prices became lower. Guns were no longer limited to kings, wealthy nobles, and professional armies. They became easier to produce, purchase, and carry. At the same time, inventors continued improving the design of firearms. For centuries, most guns could fire only once before they needed to be reloaded. Reloading during battle was slow and dangerous. Then came weapons that could fire several times. One of the most famous was the revolver, made widely successful by Samuel Colt. Its rotating cylinder allowed a person to fire multiple shots before reloading. A gun was no longer a one-shot weapon. A person could fire again, and again, and again. A few seconds could now decide the outcome of a fight. A few seconds could end several lives. Rifles also became more effective. Their barrels were designed to make bullets spin as they traveled, allowing them to fly straighter and hit targets from greater distances. A soldier could now strike someone he could barely see. War was becoming less personal. The enemy was no longer always a face standing a few steps away. Sometimes, the enemy was only a small figure in the distance. Then came an invention even more terrifying: the machine gun. Unlike an ordinary rifle, the machine gun could fire repeatedly at extraordinary speed. A single weapon could send hundreds of bullets across a battlefield in only a few minutes. One gun could do the work of many soldiers. When these weapons appeared during the age of modern warfare, military commanders struggled to understand what they had created. Old battle tactics were still based on soldiers moving together in large groups, but against a machine gun, a large group became an easy target. This horrifying reality became clear during the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, millions of soldiers lived and fought inside long trenches cut into the earth. The trenches were filled with mud, rats, sickness, fear, and death. Soldiers sometimes waited for days or weeks. Then, an officer gave the order to attack. The men climbed out of the trenches and moved across open ground. Waiting for them were machine guns. In only a few moments, entire groups of soldiers could be killed. The numbers became almost impossible to understand. During the Battle of the Somme, more than 1 million men were killed or wounded over several months. 1 million human beings. They were not simply numbers in a history book. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, and friends. Each one had a name. Each one had memories. Each one had people waiting for him to return home. Many never did. The gun had changed war from a physical struggle between individual fighters into an industrial system of death. Factories produced the weapons. Trains carried the soldiers. Governments gave the orders. And machine guns ended lives faster than anyone could count them. But even the destruction of the First World War did not end the journey. Only 2 decades later, the world entered another global conflict. The Second World War lasted from 1939 to 1945. By then, guns were faster, lighter, more accurate, and more widely available than ever before. Rifles became standard equipment for soldiers. Machine guns were placed on vehicles. Pilots fired guns from aircraft. Warships fired enormous guns across the sea. The gun had traveled from the ground to the ocean and into the sky. It was now present in almost every form of warfare. Cities were attacked. Armies were destroyed. Millions of civilians were caught in the violence. And near the end of the war, humanity created something even more powerful than any gun: the atomic bomb. It was not a firearm, but it came from the same human desire, the desire to create a weapon more powerful than the weapons of an enemy. When atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world saw where this road could eventually lead. A weapon no longer needed to kill one person at a time. It could destroy an entire city. Humanity had moved from a small mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter to a weapon capable of ending hundreds of thousands of lives. And suddenly, the question was no longer only about winning a war. The question was whether humanity could survive its own inventions. Today, guns exist in almost every part of the world. There are estimated to be more than 1 billion firearms across the planet. Some are controlled by armies. Some are carried by police officers. Some are owned by hunters. Some are kept in private homes. Modern military rifles can strike targets from great distances. Sniper rifles can hit people more than a kilometer away. Computer systems can help aim weapons. Satellites can help guide attacks. Technology has made weapons more accurate than the ancient Chinese alchemists could ever have imagined. But guns are not only used on battlefields. Every year, people are killed by firearms in streets, homes, workplaces, and schools. In the United States, there are more privately owned guns than people. For some, a gun represents safety, protection, independence, or freedom. For others, it represents fear, violence, loss, and death. This is one of the most difficult debates of the modern world. Do guns protect people, or do they place more people in danger? Can society control something so powerful? Can laws prevent violence? Can responsibility exist without restriction? There are no simple answers. Different countries have chosen different paths. Different communities have different experiences. And families affected by gun violence carry pain that cannot be explained through statistics alone. More than 1,000 years after that first accidental explosion, humanity is still trying to understand what it created. The journey began with alchemists searching for eternal life. It continued through fireworks, fire lances, cannons, revolvers, rifles, machine guns, and modern military weapons. It brought down walls. It ended the age of knights. It helped build empires. It destroyed communities. It changed borders. It transformed warfare. And it became one of the most controversial inventions in human history. But perhaps the most important lesson is not only about guns. It is about human discovery. The men in ancient China did not begin with evil intentions. They began with curiosity. They wanted to understand nature. They wanted to defeat death. And curiosity itself is not dangerous. Curiosity has given us medicine, communication, transportation, and knowledge. But every powerful discovery creates responsibility. The invention may begin inside a laboratory, a workshop, or a quiet room. What happens next depends on human choices. A discovery can be used to build. It can be used to protect. It can be used to entertain. Or it can be used to destroy. Power is never completely neutral. What we create eventually becomes part of who we are. And once something powerful enters the world, controlling it may be far more difficult than creating it. That may be the real lesson of the gun. Human beings are very good at inventing new forms of power. But we are not always equally good at understanding the consequences. Our story began with a search for immortality. Ironically, it produced a force that brought death on a scale its inventors could never have imagined. And now, more than 1,000 years later, the responsibility belongs to us. Not to the ancient alchemists, not to the first soldiers who carried fire lances, not to the kings who fired cannons at city walls. It belongs to the people living today. Because history is not only a record of what happened in the past. History is a warning. It shows us what human beings can create. It shows us what power can do. And it reminds us that every invention becomes a test of the people who control it. If you are learning English through this story, you are also gaining a kind of power. But this is a power that does not destroy. It is the power to understand, the power to communicate, the power to read new ideas, hear new voices, and connect with people from different parts of the world. Every new word you learn opens another door. Every story you understand makes the world a little larger. And every time you continue learning, you are building something inside yourself that no weapon can create and no war can take away. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. What part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the accidental discovery of gunpowder? The fall of ancient walls? The rise of the machine gun? Or the way one small experiment continued changing the world for more than 1,000 years? Share your answer in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories that help you explore history while improving your English. Because every story teaches us something about the world. And every new word gives us the power to understand it. I will see you in the next story.